Hello and welcome to our webinar, Designing for Medical Devices and Equipment, featuring our guest speaker from PolyOne, Karen Harold. We're thrilled to have Karen and PolyOne participate with us today. PolyOne Corporation is a premier provider of specialized polymer materials, services, and solutions. PolyOne employs approximately 6,900 associates, is certified ACC Responsible Care and Great Place to Work, and is a founding member of the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. Our featured guest speaker, Karen Harold, is the Senior Manager, Global Marketing for PolyOne Distribution, a key business segment of PolyOne Corporation. Karen sets strategic marketing direction to promote the advanced materials and technical solutions of PolyOne Distribution to the healthcare, automotive, packaging, and outdoor industries. Prior to joining PolyOne, she directed market development growth for Covestro with a focus on the healthcare industry, and led material processing, application development, and Six Sigma quality efforts with GE Plastics. Karen holds a BS in Chemical Engineering from the University of Michigan and an MBA in Marketing and Organizational Leadership. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. I now turn the webinar over to John Sidorowitz, Vice President of Inside Sales for Eccentric. John is a technically minded sales leader and problem solver in all things manufacturing. Having a degree in management and a very diverse background, John understands the entire manufacturing process from design to final product and everything in between. Joining John is Glenn Miller, our Senior Tooling Engineer and Quality Specialist with Eccentric. Glenn has over 25 years of experience with injection molding, including roles as a CAD tool designer and tooling engineer. Gentlemen?
Thank you everyone for joining. This is John Sidorowitz, Glenn Miller. So the agenda for today, listed here. So we're going to go over injection molding selection criteria, performance criteria for healthcare applications, sterilization methods for materials, chemical resistance, some commonly used materials, material finishes, part finishes, and then get into some design for manufacturing for injection molding.
Thanks, guys. So when we look at healthcare applications, there's several things that you need to consider. First and foremost is biocompatibility, whether it's an FDA, ISO 10993, or USP Class 6. It's really important to understand what criteria is needed and whether biocompatibility is required. Secondly is product life cycle. The healthcare applications are generally long. It takes long for the development, but also the product life cycle itself, once the components are commercialized, are normally long. Next, sterilization methods. Several different sterilization methods, and once we get into the different types of materials, it's really important to understand the different types of methods and what's compatible with the different materials. Another thing really important for healthcare applications, of course, is the cleaning and disinfecting. And this has become so much more critical with healthcare devices in which it's in a hospital environment due to hospital-acquired infections. So the chemical resistance of materials has had to evolve over the last 5 or 10 years and become much more robust to be able to withstand the types of cleaning and disinfecting that is required. And then lastly, it's obviously very important that materials have the retention of properties. So this could be strength, toughness, tensile strength, impact resistance, crack and craze resistance, and so forth. And the retention of properties in an end-use environment can be everything from filtered UV light that could come through a window, or in a healthcare application, you're looking again as sterilization methods, cleaning methods, other materials that it's exposed to, and that. So it's just really important that when you're looking at materials that you take everything into account to make sure you're retaining and optimizing material properties. So as we were touching on a minute ago with sterilization methods, several different ways to be able to sterilize components. The first here listed is gamma. And gamma is a very effective way to sterilize healthcare or medical parts. One of the considerations is that some materials do shift color with gamma radiation. So you want to first make sure the material is compatible with gamma, but also understand whether or not there's going to be a color shift. So if you have a clear material that will be impacted, materials normally go, they shift yellow and dark, or some of them can be a little gray. So it's just important to recognize that when you're choosing your sterilization method. Steam sterilization, another very effective way to sterilize medical components, and higher heat steam sterilization is autoclaving. One of the most important things with autoclaving is to understand what your heat deflection temperature is of the material that you're using for the device, so that you don't have a distortion or warpage or even material starting to melt at the autoclave temperature. So it's just important to understand whether or not your material is compatible with steam or high heat steam sterilization, such as autoclaving. ETO is very commonly used. It's probably one of the more common things that we see nowadays. Many plastic materials are compatible with ETO sterilization. So it seems to be a very good choice nowadays to use. And as listed here, there's some strict handling requirements. So obviously you want to work with somebody who's very familiar with this, but it is a very effective way to sterilize medical components, especially large volumes. With regard to chemical resistance, the base chemistries of materials are either semicrystalline or amorphous, and this can impact how chemically resistant the material is. So chemical resistance of a part is usually has these different components. So the concentration of the chemical used, obviously the higher the concentration, potentially the more the material is going to be impacted or compromised because of that chemical. The temperature, the higher the temperature, again, the more the material can be impacted by that. The length of time that it's exposed to the chemical in question, how the material is exposed to the chemical. So if it's a cleaning solution and it's being wiped versus being immersed, and then again the time temperature component as well when you're exposing it. And then last but not least is the stress level in the part. So molding becomes a real critical component of the robustness and the performance of the finished part when it's exposed to different chemicals. So if the molding is done well, you have lower stress in the part, and you're going to have less of an impact of chemical resistance from various chemicals that it may be exposed to. So now we've got a few slides where we're going to talk about commonly used materials. Now, obviously, there's a whole host of different types of chemistries and materials that are used, but these are some of the more common ones, and we chose these based on some key properties and benefits that these provide for medical applications. So the first is from DuPont. It's a Zytel material. This is a nylon 6/6. The key properties here are incredible toughness, excellent chemical resistance, the stiffness and strength, and then really compatible with various types of sterilization methods. So it makes it a really good choice. It tends to be a very tough material and good wear properties. So a lot of times you'll see this material being used for things like gears or actuators, where you're going to have a part mating against another part or rubbing up against another part because of the wear properties of this. Makes it just a great fit for these types of applications. But things that you need to consider when you're looking at this type of material, it does tend to absorb moisture. So when you're drying and processing the material, you need to make sure that the moisture level is low. Also, the shrink rates, because it's a semi-crystalline material, tend to be higher. So that that's something to consider. You want to make sure that you're working with a tool maker or a custom molder that is well aware of the shrink rates and builds the tool to be able to accommodate this material.
As far as the molding conditions, things like gating, wall thickness, support structure, and things like that are something that you always want to consider when designing your parts, as well as design for manufacturability. It's something you need to discuss early on in the project.
Absolutely. And I think this is also a reason why you want to look at material choice early on in the product development cycle, because you don't want to start cutting tools until you know exactly what material you're going to be shooting. So it's just so important, like you say, everything from the gating and the design itself, and then the processing conditions. So real important for all materials in general. So another material that's used very widely, lots of different applications, is polycarbonate. So Covestro's Macrolon polycarbonate offers great clarity. So in the natural state, polycarbonate is clear. So it lends itself really nicely to clear components such as IV sets, lures, connectors, stopcocks, sight glasses, and lenses. Polycarbonate, of course, has great impact resistance. So functional parts, whether it be surgical devices or housings, it's a real good fit. Polycarbonate is also a real good material with gamma sterilizable products as well. So its resistance to lipids and gamma makes it a good fit. The considerations when you're thinking about designing medical parts with polycarbonate is polycarbonate can be susceptible to certain types of aggressive chemicals and cleaners. And a lot of times the material suppliers will have done studies and testing to be able to tell you under what conditions different chemicals can be used. So that's just a consideration. Another consideration is that polycarbonate resins, the color can shift due to exposure to UV light and gamma sterilization. And Covestro actually does have a color adjusted material for use with gamma, so that taking into account the color shift that can take place during gamma, they do a color correction, but it's just something to consider. So polycarbonate is an amorphous material, so the shrink rates are going to be less than that of the Zytel that we just talked about. And the temperatures tend to be a little bit higher when you're processing polycarbonate. So again, just another consideration when you're comparing materials. But really a great fit across lots of different sub-markets within the healthcare industry, different types of components for polycarbonate. So next material is actually a blend with polycarbonate, and this is Covestro's Bay Blend. It's a polycarbonate ABS blend. So some of the benefits that you get from straight polycarbonate, you have with the added benefit of ABS. So you have things like both good impact, a little bit better chemical resistance, but the blend itself really lends itself to good toughness and rigidity. You get great dimensional stability. The processing temperatures are lower, so this product is actually a little bit easier to process. You usually get real good surface finish, and it can be sterilized multiple different methods, including gamma, E-beam, and ETO. So because of the nature of the good balance of properties with a PCABS, it's a real nice material for uses. It would be housings. So even if you need a flame retardant, you can compound in a flame retardant with this, and it can be used for housings, battery enclosures, bezels, access panels, control knobs. So it's really a wide variety. It also takes color really nicely. So if you have different components where you have opaque color needs, PCABS is a real good material choice. Another consideration, just like with the straight polycarbonate, is you have to consider the chemicals and cleaners that are used to make sure that they're compatible. And also, you can have a color shift due to UV exposure on this as well. So it's something just to take into account as you're choosing your color and looking at the type of sterilization method. But generally, this is really a nice kind of bread and butter product for medical. Lots of uses, and easy to design and process.
And on the tooling side of it, this is an easier material to mold, as long as you have good venting on the tool. A little more forgiving as far as the rigidity and so forth of the material, and it provides a little better color selection for you as well.
So next is the acrylic. Ultiglass, their trade name is plexiglass, so PMMA. This material has great clarity. So if you have an application where you really need great clarity, this is a real good choice. This is also BPA free, so if you happen to have an application or component that needs to be BPA free, or you'd like to market it that way, the acrylic does not contain BPA. It does provide good chemical resistance. It can be sterilized using gamma and ETO. The other added benefit is you don't see a color shift when exposed to UV. So if you have a component that's going to be exposed to UV light, either in use or through filtered light, this is not going to shift colors on you because of the UV exposure. Some considerations with the acrylic material would be exposure to higher temperatures. So this material, compared to, say, a polycarbonate that you can also get in clear, this is going to have a little bit lower heat deflection temperature compared to the polycarbonate. So you just need to review the in-use temperatures to make sure that you're not exceeding the heat deflection temperature. Also, the impact resistance is not going to be as high as a polycarbonate. So if you have a component that is going to see impact resistance, you just need to evaluate this before going with the PMMA. The applications that are real good fits for the acrylic material would be lenses. A lot of the blood collection and separation cassettes are molded with acrylic material, as well as valves, filters, and incubators.
And on the tooling side of it, as this is a little more brittle of a material, you always want to use your best design practices as far as wall thicknesses, where you're gating the part, and make sure you have no sharp corners. You want to use radiuses and transitions for bosses and things like that, and make sure you have good draft on your part.
So the next material, we had talked earlier about the PC-ABS blend. So this is straight ABS. INEOS Sterilization has a lustrine ABS, and this material is I'll say, even easier. It's an amorphous material. It is opaque, great for coloring, and good chemical resistance. It does have pretty good impact resistance because of the ABS. The B is a butyl rubber, so that rubber gives you some good impact resistance. Overall, it's a real good balance of properties. Like I'd mentioned, it's relatively easy to process. It runs at a lower temperature, and it also has good bonding properties. It makes it ideal for, I'll call it medical accessories. So caps, internal components, valves, even in labware, you can look at things like test tube racks and things like that, but also good with housings and covers. But because it runs at a lower temperature, you just need to consider the end-use temperature ranges to make sure that you're not getting too close to the heat deflection temperature so that it doesn't start warping on you. And then take a look at the impact resistance and make sure you don't need as high of an impact resistance that polycarbonate would require of this material. But overall, you know, great fit for the medical industry. So now we're going to get a little bit more into the commodity materials. Flint Hills has a medical grade polypropylene, and these materials are incredibly forgiving. They have good strength and a variety of stiffness ranges, pretty easy to process, and they do have grades that can be sterilized. They're a great fit in the labware market. So when you think of things like pipettes, vials, collection cups, lids, funnels, syringes, and even for pharmaceutical containers, this material is a real good fit for that. The considerations that you want to think about with polypropylene, of course, are going to be temperature ranges. So if you have either a secondary operation or an end-use environment where it's going to see higher temperatures, you just want to make sure that the material can withstand those higher temperatures. And then, of course, based on the wide range of rigidity, you want to make sure for your component that you're using the right polypropylene, or that polypropylene can give you the rigidity that you need for the application performance.
And this material is even easier than the ABS material to work with. It has a good flow rate. On the one side, though, it does tend to flash a little more and have some issues with warp. But again, if you're upfront with your design process and make sure you have good wall thickness and support structure on that, that's definitely something to consider right up front.
Next is actually a PolyOne product. Versaflex is our TPE material, a thermoplastic elastomer. This material is got a wide range of durometer, so it can be pretty soft and to quite rigid, but it can be autoclaved, it can be gamma sterilized as well as ETO, and it's got really good compression set properties. So it makes it ideal for gaskets, seals, things like syringe plungers, and soft touch overmold, so grips and things like that, as well as well pads or stoppers. So you can really get a lot of uses with this. The considerations that you want to think about with this material, and I know John and Glenn are going to have some more to add from the processing standpoint, but it's really important that you consider proper tool surface, and I'll let you guys talk about that in just a second. But also, it's important if you're looking at this material as an overmold, just to make sure you do testing, or that the material supplier helps you to do testing on adhesion. This particular material has really good bond strength, but it's just something that you need to consider of what is that material you're overmolding over, and that you have the bond strength that you need. But John and Glenn, I know you guys probably have something to add about processing of this material. It can be a little tricky, right?
Yeah, you definitely need some overmolding expertise, and as you said, the adhesion factor. It's you have to make sure you're overmolding this material to the proper substrate material. Make sure your surface finish on the tool is correct for the ejection process.
Really, yeah, just making sure the two materials match as far as the adhesion goes. And there's different TPEs that work with different substrate or substrate materials. So,
and a lot of times in the design process, your substrate part, it's always important to make sure when you can to mold in features that will allow the overmold material to embed itself within the substrate tool, whether that be some small little mechanical locks and things like that. So that's very important.
Just to aid with the adhesion. So on to finishes. So what we do here at Eccentric, we offer a wide array of finishes, up to an optical polish, all the way down to an equivalent of a MT11020, and as well as custom textures.
And some of those textures require laser etching and things like that.
And obviously there's post-processing that can be done in the outside, painting, EMI shielding, and other finishes like that, part cleaning, and then just making sure the chemical interactions that how you're going to be using the part. Karen, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I'll just say that of the materials that we highlighted today, very different chemical resistance to a wide array of different things, not just chemicals and cleaner in the medical industry, but even other types of materials and bonding agents and things like that. So there can be a lot of chemical interactions. I usually tell people to think about not just solids like other materials, but think about liquids and gases as well. So in a healthcare application, you can have all three of those, and it's just really important to work with a material supplier that can help you evaluate the compatibility between solid, liquid, and gas and the material you're choosing.
Leaving materials, we're going to kind of go into part design considerations.
Yeah, we've got, just some basics here on the screen. Part on the left there, you've got basically zero draft straight walls. That's never a good molding condition. You always want to, based on the material you're using, and some good draft on the tool. It just helps in molding and helps in injection of the part without stress and deformation of the parts. Down below here, you've got some minimums depending on your application here.
Yeah, typically a ½ degree is going to be the minimum for most parts, but when you get into super rigid materials, kind of like a plexiglass or an acrylic, you definitely want to have some draft to help release that part from the mold. Other forgiving materials like polypro or ABS, you may be able to get away with a little bit less draft, but typically you want to get at least a 1.5 to 2 degree draft on a part, minimum a ½ degree.
Then anything you're going to want for texture, you obviously, depending on what texture you're looking at, whether it's just a basic blast or some type of stipple, you want to make sure you go with a 3 to 5 degrees. Sometimes it's a little more depending on the depth of the stipple, but that's something you definitely need to consider.
Yeah, at the design phase.
That, earlier we were talking about the importance of the performance and the robustness of the material, and that you want to reduce the internal stresses of the component. And this is a perfect example that if the draft is not done right, you're going to introduce some molded in stresses there, and that will impact the performance of the part in the end and make it more susceptible to potential chemical attack or temperature extremes. So this is a real critical point when you're doing medical device design.
The next thing to think about is how your part's going to be gated. Is it hot tip? Is it an edge gate? Is it a cosmetic part? So that's all things to consider on your part. Edge gates are traditionally the most common, cheapest, but they do leave a visible gate vestige on the surface of the part. Getting gates off the exterior surface, like a subgate or something like that, obviously will add to the cost of the tool.
And even more, if you want to direct gate to a part, because you cannot have any type of vestige on any of the edges or other areas of the part, direct gating, whether that be a hot tip or a cold slug, it's just dependent on the function of the part and what's required for the end product. A lot of times, consideration is needed for the strength and stiffness of the parts, the application. You want to incorporate gusset ribs, rib structure. We have a small chart to the left here with different materials and kind of the sink rates. You definitely want to maintain a certain height of rib versus the width versus the wall stock. As you can see on the two right areas there, that's just showing some basic ratios that you want to kind of follow as a rule of thumb when you're designing your parts.
Right, and when you're designing your ribs, you also want to take into consideration your draft. So if you have a really tall rib that requires, if you're going 60% of the nominal wall, that those ribs can get pretty thin if they're tall. So you run the risk of not filling or trying to pack out and sticking in the mold and breaking off.
And as always, whenever possible, avoid sharp corners, things like that. Any kind of radiuses and so forth always improves the moldability of the particular part.
Yeah. So loss is kind of tied to ribs. They're usually utilized for locating or mounting for some sort of assembly. Just like the ribs, the thickness and the height are the biggest factors. So the wall of the rib should be no more than 60% of the nominal part thickness. If that thickness is less than 1/8 of an inch, which is going to be most plastic parts, And then height of the boss should be no more than 2.5 times the diameter of the hole that's within the boss. So got some examples there on how to tie ribs into corners of a part. Not trying to put them right in the corner where you have a lot of material. It's just going to create sink and just not a good surface finish on the exterior of the part.
And it's still the example to the right there is still going to provide you a good boss with good structure and good strength, without, as John said, without creating a very thick wall area, which is going to create all sorts of issues with sink marks and so forth. Sharp corners are not your friend. You definitely want to make sure anywhere possible you want to maintain a radius or some sort of transition that minimizes the potential for stress in the part. This is a pretty good example with the 3 pieces below there of what to do on your designs. You want to avoid the top one where you've got a sharp corner in there. That's just never a good idea whenever possible.
Threads and lures. Typically we see a lot of lures on medical parts that we do here. When dealing with threads, we get a lot of customers switching from metals to plastics, and the way you design metal threads is completely different than designing for plastic. So there is some rules that you have to follow. Using smaller threads can strip, from the mold.
If you're designing a male thread on your plastic part, that works well. With a metal female thread, you really don't want to go the other direction on that, as far as having that mating surface and as far as leakage and things like that. They're definitely better than a metal thread. You want to avoid edges on these because that'll affect the fit. You want to make sure that the 2 mating materials are compatible as far as shrink rates, as far as the rigidity and so forth of the 2 materials. That way the fit is what you desire.
Yeah, and add radiuses at the roots of the threads, keeping walls uniform, minimizing the stress. Just like as we talked about earlier, sharp edges can introduce stress into the parts.
Good lead in to the threaded area as well. Sometimes we have parts that have been designed with 0 lead in, and we find that the threads have been designed and molded properly, but the fit of the 2 parts is difficult to engage unless there's a good lead into that part.
And then wall thickness. So kind of got a table here on the right, just kind of giving some recommended wall thicknesses on some basic materials. So the biggest key when designing a plastic part is maintaining uniform wall thickness throughout the part. It's just going to help with material flow, help with even shrinking of the part as it's cooling.
Eliminate possibility for sink marks, exactly. Things like that. As John said, as best you can, depending on the application, make sure that your wall thickness is consistent without big sections, thick to thin. That's just going to create some flow issues and so forth that you'd be battling.
Yeah, in those thick sections, if you can core them out, introduce ribbing back into the part, and you'll get the same strength, but still have a good looking part. And just some general things here, 10% increase in wall thickness is going to increase the part stiffness about 33%.
And again, as always, good radiuses, try to minimize the sharp corners. That's kind of a thing for all design purposes to really watch out for that.
So overmolding, we kind of touched on that kind of on the last material, and we kind of saw the part there. So overmolding is taking one part, which we call the first part, the substrate, and then introducing a second material and overmolding that onto the part and create an assembly. Typically, it's going to be a more rigid substrate and then a rubber overmold just to create aesthetically pleasing parts, some color contrast, grip surfaces, things like that. In this case, you can see on the bottom left, There's some windows within the substrate, the first part, that created some mechanical holds for the TPE to lock into, as well as utilizing the chemical bond between the two materials to create this almost dial part.
And if I could piggyback off of that one as well, you know, with the home healthcare market, I mean, it's really growing now. There's a lot more that people are doing to whether it's recover at home or with wearable devices and things like that. And we're seeing a lot more flexible soft touch materials. So overmolding is used in a lot of cases to be able to achieve that. So we're seeing that more and more. And you know, the materials used in overmolding are you know, really lending itself well to ergonomics. So I feel like this area is really important in the processing, and there's a lot of different new applications that are coming out all the time that that this method is going to be needed. So it's important to work with somebody who is really good at this, because this is a specialized kind of molding.
Thank you, Karen.
Insert molding. This is a practice where you've got your plastic part design, and you also want to incorporate various inserted areas, whether that be threads or other types of areas. Yeah. This is actually placed in the mold before injection, and different shutoffs and different standoffs are used to hold that insert in place while the mold is filled. And then the end product is plastic surrounding that inserted area and creates a single part, avoids the need for some sort of secondary operation where those things would have to be added later. This incorporates it directly into the part in one shot.
So undercuts, it's basically any indentation or protrusion that comes outside of the part or with inside the part that prohibits the part from ejecting from the mold. It's typically going to be, you know, holes on sidewalls, snap features, clips, things like that, where you're going to require a slide or a hand load or a hand pick or something to create that feature in the part. The big thing is you want to design your part to eliminate as many of these as possible. Obviously, they're going to be required if you have to, but there are some tips and tricks that you can kind of use to still capture the feature just in a little bit different way, and we've got some examples of that here below on the right. You know, creating a window to capture a clip, putting a side hole or a hole in a sidewall, as well as some, you know, vents, I would call it, in the far right picture there.
And the key with those top designs is this is still allowing this tool to be designed as an open and shut tool with no actions required. That simplifies things. It's cheaper. Certain applications, this is the way to go. Down below there, you see the same features. Where it is required to have some sort of pull, a slide, lifter, or other mechanism to form those holes, which can be done as well, but again, at a higher cost.
That kind of brings us to our Q&A session.
We have a couple that have come in. The first one, Karen, I think this really goes back to some of your final slides about sterilization. How many times can a part be re-sterilized, or what's the resistance ability to this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark. There's a lot of healthcare OEMs that are looking to see if they can, instead of making parts disposable, they're looking at reusing them. So there are more and more questions about the material performance upon multiple sterilization methods. A lot of those fall in the area of autoclave, which it seems like we hear that one a lot. And the material suppliers are starting to do a lot more testing in-house with molded components using the materials that are compatible with high heat seam sterilization, the autoclave. And, you know, as an example, I know that Covestro has a high heat polycarbonate that's called APEC. That material, they've they've done testing, and they're seeing 50 to 100 repeat steam sterilization cycles and still maintaining robust performance. So I would say that the materials are being modified to be able to withstand more and more sterilization cycles, because that's definitely a trend in the medical industry now. But I would say work closely with your material supplier first to see what they would recommend if they have data to be able to support that. And of course, it's going to be dependent on the type of sterilization that that's being used. But that's a great question. That's really being asked more and more these days.
And we have another question, and this probably goes to Glenn and John. What impact does a polymer change have on molds?
Well, I mean, the obvious is a tool is designed to a specific material with a specific shrink rate, specific properties. That's not to say that we can't. Very often our customers come to us and start with one material, prove that tool out. They want to go to a different material. It can be done. We can run that material with the understanding that the properties and specs of that material may change your dimensions, may change warpage, may change other issues, create other issues with your part. So it's not always a one-to-one, just swap a material out in an injection mold and get the same results. So it's definitely something to consider. Sometimes that requires a redesign of a tool to account for that shrink rate.
Okay. And what I take to be sort of an add-on to this question is, for something such as a polymer that is known to have warpage issues, if a designer can't change polymer, what can they do to avoid or minimize the amount of warp?
We can look at the gating, where this part is gated. If it's a long, flat part, you can gate it in certain areas. Usually a part like that, just in an example, you gate at one end and flow across the part. If you gate in the middle, it completely changes how that part is formed and how it reacts after it comes out of the tool. A lot more warpage. So gating's one way. Rib structure for sure will definitely help maintain the structure of that part. Other factors as far as the processing goes that can help, speed and heats and different things like that can be adjusted at the press to help process that material out.
Yeah. So, Karen, one of the things that we tell the clients that we work with is get us involved early so we can help with the design based on whatever polymers you select. What does PolyOne recommend as far as help for material selection?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's the same message that we tell our customers as well, Mark, is working with a material supplier early on in the development cycle. Not only does it help you to see what range of materials might be considered, but also, we can also help with design and to be able to provide necessary documentation. So if our customers are designing a component that needs the FDA 10993 Part 1 for biocompatibility, of course there's a lot of documentation involved in that. So working with PolyOne early in the process, and we start to look at different materials that meet that requirement, we can also provide the necessary documentation to help with the 510K submission of that component. So earlier is certainly better with options, with design, with necessary documentation, and various types of engineering support we can provide as well.
And really, early on, always a great idea to get everybody involved. Our experience, PolyOne's a great partner. After the fact, when we're still having some issues, the customer's not completely happy with the part they are getting, they're more than willing to jump in and help us out and discuss with the customer options moving forward and new materials and so forth.
So the earlier they get us involved, the better it is for
everybody.
experiences for everyone.
Correct.
All right. Well, I want to thank Karen and PolyOne for participating today, and John and Glenn. Thank everybody for joining us today. We will send a link to the recording within 48 hours. And again, if you have any questions about today's topics, please feel free to email us either at the sales at eccentricmold.com or info@eccentricmold.com. And we thank you again have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.